All right. So, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are tuning in from. And again, I love knowing where all of our viewers are coming from. So, if you want to put in where you are watching the webinar from, since it's the Global Bat Diversity Network, put in where you are tuning in from so we can know where in the globe you are watching from. But otherwise, I'm very excited to kick off our 2026 webinar series for My Field for Dummies with an incredible science communicator and educator, Dr. Alyson Brokaw, who I've had the pleasure of knowing for years now, and has even published a book as of last year, the Weird and Wonderful World of Bats. Is that right?
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay. So if you, it's for everyone. So highly recommend it. And Dr. Brokaw is also a research specialist in the sensory systems of bats. And so she is going to be giving her talk here in just a little bit, the sensory world of bats. Otherwise, we can be ready. One last little housekeeping item is that we do have our webinar for next month planned as well. So we can be, if you want to be, if you are interested in our webinar next month, we are going to be having a talk on forest management practices and bats. So just a kind of a little preview for what we'll be talking about next month. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and pass off the control to Dr. Brokaw to go ahead and start her talk. So thank you so much for joining us this morning and so excited to listen.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to Dana for inviting me. And thank you to everyone who's shown up. So I will be talking about kind of broadly sight, sense, and sounds. So really thinking about the sensory world of bats, and really focusing on thinking about sensory behavior in bats and how we study it, some of the cool things that we have found. And then I'll also talk a little bit about research I have done, which has focused on the sensory system, which is our sense of smell, or sorry, not our sense of smell, the bat sense of smell, and thinking about how bats are using smell. So I did want to, oops, here we go. Come on, wake up. There we go. I did want to kind of just start off with just like a quick little intro. For those of you who don't know me, I think I saw maybe some familiar names in the chat, but so I am from the United States. I did an undergrad at Cornell University, where I actually started working on birds. So while I have since switched to the better, the cooler nighttime flyers, I do still have a soft spot for birds, and experience there. And then I've been working in bats for um, over 10 years now. So I did a master's at what is now Cal Poly Humboldt. And that was when I really started working on bats, having gotten interested in them sort of during the last year of my undergrad. I did a PhD at Texas A&M, so kind of have bounced around the country a little bit. And I will talk about some of the work that I did during my PhD, which did focus on the olfactory sense in bats. I've had the good fortune, and the grace to be able to do a lot of field work, mostly pretty much in neotropical countries. So I will apologize. I know this is global bat network. Much of my examples and research is all very biased towards the neotropical and New World bats. But I hope people are able to take what I talk about and hopefully apply it to some of our flying foxes and bats from other parts of the world that I have not had a chance to get to yet. So hopefully someday. Um, I did do a postdoc at Lehigh in Pennsylvania, where I actually sort of detoured for a little bit, and was working on mice. But I am very happy to say that I am back to focusing on bats, and now have my own lab at Cedar Crest College, which is a small women majority liberal arts college in Eastern Pennsylvania. I think we're less than 1,000 undergrads. So undergraduate teaching focus, and I'm very excited to get to kind of start my own research program. And then, even though I'm not very good at it, and Dana did already mention it, but I did also recently have a book published, came out almost a year ago, a couple days short, of The Weird and Wonderful World of Bats, which is a general science book about just all things bats, and trying to get other people to love bats as much as I do. So to kind of think about and really dive in now to the sensory world of animals and specifically of bats, is I always like to think what we call this the animal's Umwelt. And I apologize for my German speakers if I have completely butchered that. But basically, this concept is the idea of an organism's unique, subjective, perceptual world that is shaped by its specific senses and abilities. So if you can see in this video, we have a little mouse running around kind of behind a shed. And you can see it kind of moving around, jumping up on things. So thinking about what is it that this animal is experiencing as it's doing these things, and how that experience is going to be unique and different compared to the way we as humans experience the world. And so what I say that I work on, and often frame myself as, is a sensory ecologist. So to define what sensory ecology is, right, it's the study of how animals are receiving and responding to information from their environment. So if we're thinking about that perceptual Umwelt environment that the animal is experiencing, it's what is coming in, and then how does the animal respond to that information? And right, this covers a range of your sort of basic senses. I love this. This is a star-nosed mole nose and face, which they have these incredibly sensitive tactile sense where they can sense vibrations as they're moving through the ground. But also thinking about things like vision and hearing. And again, kind of right, this idea that other organisms experience the world differently than we do as humans. And so if I'm a human, right, I see the yellow of this dandelion, but if I am a honeybee or a bumblebee, I may be seeing a completely different set of stimuli. And to me, that's really fascinating and what is really cool about sort of sensory ecology. And so to kind of bring that into bats, right, you can imagine we have this purple bat here who is out flying around in the forest. There are all these stimuli coming in. There is wind, there are insects, there is different noises, there is light, either from, the sunset or the moon. There is odor molecules that are floating around, right? Plumes of smell. And so all of these right, things from the environment are going to be, bombarding our individual, coming in and being perceived by the individual, who then has to, or then decides or does behaviors in response to those stimuli. So if a bat hears the sound of another bat, does it, is it attracted to that stimuli, or is it repelled? And right, what is that being driven by? Is it because of competition or because of facilitation? So I do want to kind of caveat that at the sacrifice of depth, to try to have a lot of breadth in this presentation, I'm really going to be focusing on kind of this like stimuli in and out aspect, and really more of the out and behavior. But I do want to mention that, if we're thinking about an organism and the way it's responding to its environment and the behaviors that it's doing, sensory or otherwise, right? It's this whole, history of its genetic code, its morphology, its physiology, where it lives, its evolutionary history, brain and cognition. So I don't want to discount those things. I do just want to caveat that we'll be focusing mostly on kind of the what's coming in, and then how do we measure that using behaviors, which is where most of my research has kind of been centered around. And I wanted to open by talking about Spallanzani's bat problem, to really think about this as kind of a case study of, right, an animal's Umwelt. We are not a bat. What is it like to be a bat? And how do we figure out what bats or other animals, how do we figure out what it is that they are experiencing and responding to? So for those who are not aware, so Lazzaro Spallanzani was a 18th century Jesuit priest who did a lot of experiments and a lot of work in various elements of natural history, but is particularly famous for his experiments on bats. And he had observed, and I love this just because it right speaks for the time, but owls, when you blew out the candle, an owl had a much harder time navigating in the dark, whereas bats had no problem, right? They didn't need candlelight, they didn't need light to get by. And right, we as humans, we are very visual. We need light, and so this was very puzzling. And so Spallanzani systematically went through and essentially experimentally blocked a bunch of the different senses. Hearing, he plugged ears, he covered eyes, plugged noses. He covered bats in oil to like limit sensory touch signals, and all of these things, the bats still could fly. So it actually left him very puzzled, and he basically proposed that bats were using some unknown sixth sense. It did Louis Jurine, who was another kind of contemporary natural history experimenter, kind of repeated some of these experiments. And in his experiments, he did find that when he blocked the hearing of bats, they had a much harder time getting around. And so and then Spallanzani, I think, kind of also redid it and it was like, oh, I didn't do it as well. So, right, there's a lot of challenges here. But basically, right, this was in 1798. It wasn't until Don Griffin and Robert Galambos, with advances in technology to be able to detect sounds above and below human hearing range, that we really, in 1938 and 1941, that we really started to understand that bats were in fact using ultrasound or sounds above human hearing range to navigate. So it took almost 150 years from figuring out that hearing was important to actually understanding or starting to understand what it was how bats are doing this. And of course, right, the sensory research world has since exploded, and we continue to see really cool new technological advances. But I wanted to kind of talk about this because why did it take 150 years? Because we don't talk bat, right? So for those of us who maybe wear glasses or contacts, myself included, you've probably, if you've been to an eye doctor, you've seen this chart. This is the Snellen chart. It's a way to measure visual acuity, so how well we are able to discern detail at different distances. And so if I go into the eye doctor and they tell me, okay, read from line 7, right, I just do that. Unfortunately, we can't really do that with animals or with bats. And so I do love this illustration from Kristen Jonassen of sort of, okay, if we have a bat, how do we say, okay, bat, tell us what you see, right? Because a bunch of letters has no bearing on a bat's umwelt, on their perceptual world. So I think it's just sort of right, again, kind of thinking about how do we think about what other animals are experiencing. And there are different ways, right, to experimentally do this. So like I kind of said, right, we can't really just ask the bat, like, hey, did you see this or did you smell this? At least not in the way that we can with humans, but we can, right, get at ways to do this experimentally. So one way is, and I'm only going to briefly touch on this, is thinking about, we have these stimuli coming in that are being sensed by the nervous system. And so if we can use things like auditory brain stem response or other neurophysiological recordings where you're putting electrodes into nervous tissue, such as the brain or the spinal cord, and basically say, like, hey, if we play this sound, are the nerves being triggered? Is something happening at the physiological level to indicate that this animal is tuned into this stimuli? So in the case of auditory brain response or ABRs, right, this is playing sounds and seeing, are the nerves being triggered? And so you can then formulate these kind of curves that look at, if you play different sounds at different intensities, what is the behavior of what are the nerves doing, right? And this is a way to just say, like, is this stimulus even being detected by the cells? And this kind of work can give us some really cool insights into things like behavior and ecology. So this is an example from 2021, where the researchers went out. They did these auditory brainstem recordings in 12 species of gleaning insectivorous bats. So gleaning bats are the ones that are taking prey off of surfaces, so off of like the ground or tree trunks or leaf surfaces. And they tend to be really good at listening to things like the sounds of footsteps or rustling sounds that might be made by their prey. And what was interesting about this was that with doing all of these tuning curves for the auditory sensitivity, the researchers were kind of able to see that, like, oh, we see differences in the tonal sensitivity across different frequencies, and that these species differences for this sensitivity is maybe linked to the types of things that they are eating. So our species that have high sensitivities at lower frequencies are the species that are more likely to, or maybe specializing on prey such as crickets or frogs, which produce sounds at lower frequencies. So it can give us definitely some insight into what bats are doing, simply by looking at what they're receiving in terms of this stimuli. And then, right, sensory ecology is not just what's coming in, but it's also then how is the animal responding to the stimulus. And so this is the behavior that we see. So if we have sensory input coming in, I again apologize for the mouse example. Like I said, I kind of took a brief sabbatical to bats, or from bats, for a while, but we're back. But mice are still a great way to illustrate some of these concepts. So if you have a sensory input coming in, we can then measure what is the behavior that's happening in response to these stimuli, and as we either manipulate the stimuli that are being presented, or in some cases, like within model organisms, we can even manipulate how the animal is receiving that stimulus at the cellular level. And then look at what happens in the behavior. And that's what I really have focused on, is sort of what's the behavior that's coming out of these stimuli. So if we're thinking about how do we do that, how do we get at the behaviors that are coming from, right, sense what the animal's experiencing in terms of its senses, you can kind of think about this as natural versus trained behaviors. So natural behaviors are right behaviors that the animal is doing in its natural environment. So can we use those behaviors to test things about what is it that they're responding to? So things like hunting, roosting, or even escape behaviors. So this is an example from, this is in the frog-eating bat, Trichopterosis, of sort of taking advantage of, they are natural hunters. And so if we present them with a bunch of different sort of sensory inputs and sensory types of prey, what is it that they're choosing? And then when you're thinking about sort of this natural versus trained behavior, right, it's also thinking about, like, do we want repetition? Do we want to be able to do this multiple times? And are we worried about other aspects of, right, that sensory world? I kind of said, like, hey, we're kind of going to mostly ignore things like evolutionary history and cognition. But of course, those things are also, in play depending on the type of question that you're asking. Right, if we're thinking about these sensory questions, what is it that is being asked, and what are we trying to understand about the sensory world of an animal or of a bat? So you can kind of, at the basis level, break this up into sort of three main questions. So the first is, can you detect something? Can a bat detect a thing? So can you see the white duck icon here? Can you detect and see there is also a black duck here? And depending on the brightness of your screen, you may or may not be able to see that, right? So that is the detection question. And then we can ask about discrimination. So can a bat tell the difference between two things? So we now have two more ducks. One is like a whitish gray, and then one is like a greenish gray. So can you distinguish between those two colors, right? Can you discriminate that those two things are different? And then do you have a preference? I personally love green, so maybe I, would be more attracted to the green duck versus the yellow duck, simply because of either a personal preference or potentially some kind of ecological preference, right, for that particular object. And so knowing these questions is going to kind of help shape how we ask and how we use behavior to determine the way that bats are responding to these sensory inputs. So one way that's been used a lot for discrimination of acoustic signals in particular is what we call the habituation dishabituation paradigm. So this is where you take a single stimulus, you present that to a resting subject until they stop responding. So our nervous systems, when we are exposed to the same stimulus for a long time, eventually kind of sort of start to shut it out a little bit. So you may experience if you've ever gone like nose blind, where you sort of stop smelling like the trash that you haven't taken out, or if you hear there's like that annoying noise that eventually you kind of your brain just sort of filters out. So right, we get used to a stimulus, and then if we present a new stimulus, if we are able to discriminate that that new stimulus is different, it should trigger a change in the behavior. So to show you what this looks like, this is an example in a Himalayan leaf-nosed bat, where the researchers were interested in understanding if these bats could discriminate, so right, tell the difference between two different things, of territorial social calls from one geographic region compared to a different geographic region. So they had looked at the calls themselves and found that the calls contained differences in the structure and the frequencies of the calls. And the question now is, do the bats, can they detect that difference? So we have our bat, right, who's kind of hanging quietly. And then as we shift into the second stimulus, you start to see that the bat goes from being very still to, right, wiggling its ears, lifting up its head, right? So that would indicate that something in that change of stimulus, the bat has detected and responded to that change. So this bat is able to discriminate between these two calls, even if we can't tell exactly which thing that they are discriminating between. And so this kind of habituation paradigm is really useful in assessing perceptual differences in naive individuals. So it takes zero training to have a bat be hanging out and just listening to things, which can be really great if the question that you're asking, right, you don't want there to be a learned component. And this particular method has been used quite widely, mostly for looking at acoustic signals, where there's a nice kind of on-off, where the sound is either on or it's off. It doesn't really linger in the environment. To look at things like, can bats detect group signatures? Can they tell individuals apart? Can they tell, bats from different geographies apart? And these are just some of the species in which this has been shown. Velvety free-tailed bats, greater horseshoed bats, and the Megaderma lyra. And this is not comprehensive at all. So this has been a really widely used tool, but it's not the only one. So another way to think about or to ask a bat, right? We can't just say, hey, what's this say? But how do we ask them to, using their behavior inform us of what it is that they are detecting or not detecting, is this what's called the two alternative force choice test. So this can be used to measure sensory behavior in either naive or trained animals, depending on the specifics of your question. And it's basically asking an animal to choose between at least two, but sometimes more stimuli. So if we present, right, a white duck and a green duck, and you ask the animal to choose one of those sides, it's force choice because an animal must make a decision. And this is very frequently used to help figure out things like detection thresholds and discrimination. So does the animal detect the stimulus at all? And then do they detect differences between types of stimulus? And you have a correct and a wrong choice for each trial. And the S plus, or the correct choice, is often used with a reward. So this can be done with naive individuals, but it is also frequently done in a training and testing phase, where that positive stimulus is rewarded some way. So in the case of insect bats like this one, things like mealworms. And so to give you an example of this in action, so this little cute guy is the Mexican free-tailed bat. And so researchers were interested in understanding how these Mexican free-tailed bats, which are echolocators, they are great models for echolocation because of how flexible their echolocation calls can be. And so they're interested in using this two-force choice alternative assay to measure the limits of texture discrimination using echolocation. So basically asking, can a bat using echolocation only, can a bat detect the difference between different textures? So they used sandpapers in a variety of grit sizes, going from coarse to fine. And I believe it was something like 18 to 20 options. Where the court, when the bats were presented with two things, if the bat approached and crawled or tried to crawl on the coarse grit side, that was considered rewarded. That was the positive stimulus. If it chose the finer grit between the two, that was unrewarded. And so these bats were quickly trained to know that, okay, I have to choose the coarser grit to get my mealworm reward. These particular species can be very food motivated. I will speak from experience. And so what the researchers then did here is they also confirmed that these different textures, this different coarseness of sandpapers do produce differences in the echoes. So the stimuli that a bat would be receiving, if they're echolocating and then receiving that echo back, that stimulus should be different. And so the question is, can the bats tell that it's different? Right, we can mathematically. And so they do find that these differences in echoes bats can discriminate between them. And they did so exceedingly well. So they only had trouble really between when they were presented with two options that were very close in differences of grit. So I think between the 150 and the 180, and between 220 and 240. So if they were presented with a flat plexiglass surface versus a really fine sandpaper that was still coarse, they would successfully choose that. But they struggled when things were too similar to each other. And that difference was calculated to be a texture difference as little as 23 micrometers in terms of that the difference, the sizes between those like bumps on the sandpaper. And what's really cool about this is that this is being done only using sound, and is fairly, it's not as good, but it's comparable to how well humans can do this by using touch. So the fact that bats are able to do this only with sound is kind of incredible. Just right, bats are just so cool. And I do want to, right, so thinking about bat training and how we do this. So how do we, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. How do you train your bat? Mostly because I learned a lot about how not to do it. But I did want to kind of share this story because I think it speaks to sort of thinking about from that kind of methodological, or like if you were to be interested in these kinds of questions, how do you do this? So early in my PhD career, I was interested in still the Mexican free-tailed bat, the bat we just learned about, their texture discrimination. But I was interested in how they are using social odors. And so I spent a lot of time trying to train these bats in a similar assay where it was a Y maze. One side would have an odor, one side did not. And the idea was I wanted to train them to go to the odor. And I spent hours and hours and hours trying to train these bats over many days. This is just some of the days. And you can see that if a 50% chance of being correct, these bats really never improved. They did not get better at this task despite my best efforts. And I will be honest, I was kind of just like, you know what, maybe these bats are just too dumb to train. Except as you can see, right, that they're not. They can be trained. And it comes down to, again, right, that animal's perceptual environment. What are the cues that they care about and that they attend to? This bat is is an auditory specialist. And so, right, getting them to pay attention to an odor, maybe in the method I was doing it, was clearly not the best way. So we did do some shifts, right? So this ended up not really being super significant, and I ended up pivoting to the work I'll talk about in a second. But again, I think it's worth kind of just thinking about from that case study perspective of, you know, the other way that I was trying to train these bats, they were not responding because I couldn't just tell them, hey, idiots, use smell. Don't use echolocation. Don't use vision, right? Don't use all these other senses. I'm trying to get you to pay attention to one thing. I couldn't just tell them that. And so again, right, thinking about even if you're using training or using these kind of choice elements of behavior, thinking about what is it the animal is doing in the wild. So these bats are crevice seeking or crevice roosting bats. They love to squish themselves into tiny spaces. And so, we worked to adjust our assay. It was still two choices, but instead of, having to go down a long thing to a tube, they just had to squish themselves into a space that did or didn't have an odor. So even though this ended up not being significant and I ended up pivoting, I do think it's kind of an interesting way of kind of illustrating, like, how do we think about how we ask bats what they sense? Which brings me to thinking about, right, these more naturalistic and field assays. So thinking about what is an animal doing in its natural environment as it's out flying around, trying to find fruit from a tree, et cetera, and how can we take advantage of that, or even use that to ask questions about what the bat is experiencing. And I think this is a really cool, so I know I advertise sight, sense, and sounds, but we're going to detour over to touch, which just didn't have the cool alliterative title. But this is some recent work looking in nectar feeding bats in the Glossophica soracina, thinking about tactile cues. So these bats have these unusual whisker bristle formations where they have these forward-facing bristles along the bottom of their chin. And it's pretty well established that in mammals in general, whiskers and vibrissa are important for tactile cues. So they help with things like spatial awareness, detecting movement of or vibrations of air and water, and detecting changes in things like airflow. And so the question was, we see these in these nectar feeding bats. We don't really see it in some of these other bats. Could it be related to the sensory cues that these nectar feeding bats are using when they're feeding from a flower? And so the researchers in this experiment, they recorded these bats feeding from artificial flower. They did this with the whiskers still intact. So this video here is an example of a bat who still has those vibrissa intact. You can kind of see the bat approaching. You can see kind of where it's sticking its head in, which I'm going to alert you to as something to kind of think about when I show you the second video. And then the bat sticks its head all the way in and chooses to feed here. And then this is a video where the bats vibrissa were clipped. And so you can see it kind of coming in approach, these incredible high speed videos has been slowed down quite a bit. And you can kind of see the bat now, as it's trying to come in, sort of is pausing, and it actually kind of bumps up against the bottom of the tube. And this actually chose to abort this feeding attempt. So the researchers did this with a bunch of bats, right, and looked at the positioning of the bats as they're coming in to approach these flowers based on whether or not they had these vibrissa intact or if they had been clipped. And they found that removing these whiskers did affect bat head positioning. So the bats were changing their approach to be lower and less centered within the flower opening itself. And so this does suggest that these tactile cues are important for these nectar feeding bats to calibrate their positioning as they're coming into a flower, right? To make sure that they are actually going into the opening of a flower and not just like smashing their face into it potentially. And this was further strengthened. I don't show the data, but they also looked at this vibrissa presence and length across various species of nectar feeding bats and non-nectar feeding bats. And find that these nectar feeding bats are more likely to have this cue, again, suggesting, right, that link between the sensory cue that an animal is relying on and its ecology, right, what it's actually feeding on and what it's actually doing in the wild. And then for my main interest in terms of research, after failing to ask questions about social behavior in these insect-eating bats, I was also very interested in thinking about sensory search. So if we think back to those types of questions that I talked about that we can ask with sensory systems of, right, does the bat detect a thing? Does it discriminate between two things? Does it have a preference for two stimuli? My question that I was interested in is, given that the bat has detected or has discriminated, how does the bat use that stimuli to get from point A to point B? So if we have this fruit eating bat out flying around in this forest, some of the trees have fruit, some of them don't. The bat is echolocating, there is air flow moving, right? Some of the fruits are a certain color. What are the cues that this bat is going to use to say, aha, that tree has fruit, that's where I'm trying to go. Right, if we think about this broadly, the potential options are things like vision, looking at color differences, sound, right? They are actively echolocating. Fruits themselves don't make a sound, so maybe not in terms of passive location. Um, then there's also right elements of cognition. So trees generally don't move. And so if a bat kind of knows where things are generally in its home range, right, going off of just what it remembers. And then I was interested in whether or not these bats can follow an odor plume back to its source. And we know that many animals have been shown to do this. A lot of work has been done, particularly in rodents such as mice and rats. But also in people can do this, right? We can follow an odor gradient using things like concentration differences, where concentrations are lower the farther away you are from the source. I wanted to ask, can bats use those cues to get themselves from point A to point B using their sense of smell? And I was thinking about this, right, because you'll just have to kind of take my word for it, take the words of many other researchers, where we've shown that particularly fruit and flower feeding bats do use odor. People have used these various behavioral methods to say bats are able to detect different odors. They are able to discriminate between different types of food resources, right, ripe versus unripe fruits, or different types of flower odors. So we know that many bats, right, they have the olfactory capabilities to do this discrimination. And my question was, can they use it for localization? Can they follow the odors? So this work was done kind of in two pieces. So I did my first bit of fieldwork was in Belize. And this was focused in the Sternera pardens, the yellow-shouldered bat, and thinking about how do bats follow an odor gradient when they are crawling on a surface. So you can see here, this is an example of the assay. This was kind of the assay I designed here was sort of a combination between that two alternative force choice tests, where the bat was asked to make a decision between two options, but combined with what we call an open field assay. So I wasn't forcing the bat to choose a direction too soon, because I wanted to see what the behaviors were going to be as the bat was searching, as the bat was making its decisions. So asking, right, can bats do this task? And so I did this with a few different stimuli presentations. So bats were asked to choose between a ripe banana and something that was shaped like a banana. They were asked to choose between just banana odor and a shape that did not have an odor, and then asked to choose between odor versus no odor. So no, presumably, echolocation shape for them to rely on. And then I looked across 4 different concentrations to see if we would see differences in how this behavior evolved, kind of thinking about sort of from a sensitivity perspective. And then not only just can they do it, but what were the strategies that they're using to actually complete this behavior? So in terms of were bats able to do this? Luckily, the answer was yes. Otherwise, I would have had to pivot again and find probably a new thing to do my PhD research on. And so we did find that they had 2 options. So, right, a 50% chance of success if they choose randomly would be 50%. They perform significantly above that for both banana versus banana-shaped object. They overwhelmingly choose an odor over just an unodored shape. And they also would choose the odor even when there was no shape being presented. So this was done in the dark to minimize visual cues, but because we can't really just plug up a bat's echolocation and also ask them to use their sense of breathing, I had to try to, this is attempts to control sort of for potential echolocation cues. And in general, right, we were able to show that bats, they're using odor, right, to make these decisions. And their performance in terms of how well they can do this did vary with odor concentration. So stronger odor concentrations, bats tended to do better, had an easier time of completing this task. And as the odor concentration went down, their success rates also went down, but still remained fairly high. So they still remained above chance even when odor concentrations were fairly low. And looking at differences between these, we really only saw differences between some of these higher concentrations and the lower concentrations. 10% seemed to be the sweet spot for what these bats were responding to. In addition to looking at whether or not bats could do this, right, I was also interested in what are the strategies that bats are using. So we used video tracking software to follow the bats as they did this and looked at the shapes, the speeds at which they were moving as they completed these tasks. And looked at things like where in the arena were they making this decision across these different types of trials and whether or not the trials were successful or unsuccessful. And then place this against a sort of a simulated background of what is the actual olfactory environment that the bat is experiencing during these tasks. And so just to kind of orient you, so right, so the color scheme here is how strong is the odor. You can see that it's very strong, closest to where the odor was presented, and very quickly dissipates. But bats were making decisions most often kind of within this 20 or 15 to 30-ish range, suggesting that's around when they're receiving enough olfactory information to confidently make this decision. And also suggests, right, that they're pretty sensitive to this smell. So they, in terms of their discrimination ability, while we weren't explicitly testing that, this suggests pretty high sensitivity, on par or even maybe better than some of the other mammals in which these types of questions have been tested. Now, of course, bats aren't usually crawling around on the ground to forage, right? They're the only flying mammals. One of the reasons we love them. And so the next question was, okay, how do bats do this now when they're in flight, when we are even more, right, naturalistic, based on what they're doing when they're out flying around foraging in the forest? And so the next question, right, was, can we use flying bats? Can they still do this? Can they still use odor to find the rewards? Remember, I'm interested in how they're getting from point A to point B. And so we did this with banana and an odor cue, and then again using video and tracking software, this time in 3 dimensions, to look at what are the behaviors that the bats are doing as they're completing this task. So not just what's the result, but how did they get there? And then thinking about how is this strategy potentially different from a bat when it's crawling. So this is an example of a behavioral trial. So this was work done in Panama at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute. And so the bat was released into this room where there were 5 platforms. There were 2 video views, so this is only 1 video view, which is why you only see the 4 platforms. You can see that the bat circles around for a little while. This one here, which also has the microphone on it in this particular trial, is where the odor is. And so you can see the bat kind of flies around, starts to pass over it, eventually lands, picks up the banana and leaves with its prize. So this would be a successful trial. And so, first question, can bats find this odor source? Yes. So if we look, so in that video, right, we saw that bat kind of circled around. It sort of approached that platform a couple times before it actually landed. So if we look at the final choice, so where the bat actually landed, they do great. It doesn't matter if it's banana or just a banana smell. They are very successful, right? A to A pluses for these bats. But if we look at our successful bats and we look at which platform they first went up to and first approached, they are really doing no better than random in terms of where they are first going in order to locate this odor source. And so if we looked across like how many of these platforms did these bats try to look at, they look at about half of the five that are available. And so what this suggests to us is that, right, they're maybe not using the odor cue per se to navigate. If they were following the odor plume, they should be approaching the correct platform first, maybe getting slightly confused, maybe if with a nearby platform, but that's not really what we saw happening. We saw a lot of sort of check out a few things, and then eventually they get it right. And we also saw what we described as this inspection behavior, which is that kind of horizontal flight over top of the platforms. And so in using the three-dimensional reconstructions of the flight paths, we looked at how fast the bats were moving when they're doing these inspection flights and compared to just a random point in the trial. And the bats are moving significantly slower at those points of inspection compared to just when they're flying around. And they're also getting very close. So when I estimated minimum vertical distance above the odor cue, they're getting within 6 centimeters. And so you might remember in the crawling bats, they were making decisions within 15 to 30 centimeters. So the flying bats are having to get much closer than the crawling bats in order to probably get the cues and make this decision. And a lot of this has to do with when bats are flying, right? The faster you move, the harder it is to not only breathe, but also get the olfactory input. And so bats are having to get closer and also use other strategies that aren't related to their sense of smell. So potentially memory, things like spatial cognition to figure out where this odor source is. And so can bats follow odors? Maybe. But then the question is, do they? And there's actually not just this work, but in other work a little bit before and since that has shown that in many of these bats, right, spatial learning and other aspects of ecology maybe are overriding the sensory cues that are coming in from odor, which I think also, right, just kind of helps highlight some of the challenges, but also some of the opportunities for understanding and thinking about how bats are experiencing their world. And so we know that in our fruit bats, that they use odors to detect and discriminate food resources. But our understanding of olfactory cues in non-fruit bats does still remain somewhat limited. And I will touch on this briefly. There's going to be a lot of things that I am leaving out in terms of sensory world of bats. But I do want to briefly talk about sort of social communication. So this was my initial interest in odors. We do a recent review kind of looked across like all these different groups of bats, looking at the different glandular structures and the ways in which they produce what are presumably social odors. But I would also argue that, and efforts are increasing, but that many of these times, these gland secretions, we don't always pair behavioral observations with them. So I think it is really important to think about, right, we can look at the genes, we can look at the neurophysiology, we can look at these production of glands, but without the behavior, right, it's really hard to truly understand what a bat is experiencing in terms of that sensory world. So some of the best work, right, is gonna start to combine these things, and there's definitely a lot of cool work out there doing exactly this. So just as an example, again with the Trachops, this is a frog-eating bat. They put this crust on their forearm, the males do, and it's very smelly. And so it was sort of interesting of like, okay, why are they doing this? Is it a sexually selected signal? Are they using it to attract females? And so by doing a forced alternative choice assay, asking the bats to show, do you have a preference between these two odors, right? They were able to show that actually females didn't have a preference, but males avoided it. So it may be part of a sexually selected signal, but it's not an attracted for females, but maybe more of something maybe territorial, right? And so kind of making sure that we're testing sort of these ideas with the behavior that the bats are actually using. And then I want to kind of wrap up. I know I'm running a little bit tight on time, but why should we care about a bat's sensory world, right? Why do we care that a bat can or can't use an odor, or the textures that a bat can discriminate. And I think if we think about this in context that the world is changing, right? The sensory environments that bats and other animals are experiencing, that we are experiencing, continues to shift and change, particularly with human activity. So looking at how bright the night is, right? As we get more and more cities, more and more lights are on, right? The sky is getting brighter, right? We're seeing more light pollution. If we think about noise, right? If you've ever, I grew up in the country, and anytime I stayed at a friend's house who was anywhere near a road, like I could not sleep because there was just too much noise and I was not used to it, right? So thinking about like, okay, there's right all these other stimuli that are increasing or changing, and how do animals respond to that? And how does that impact their ability to engage in their sensory responses and behaviors? Right? Because these animals are making decisions based on this sensory stimuli, whether it's to be attracted to a mate, or it's to find food, or it's to choose a habitat, or if it's to leave a habitat. So changing sensory environments means that and animals may have to think about changing the behaviors and the decisions. And so we can see a lot of different types of what is being referred to as sensory pollution. So things like masking. So if a stimuli that an animal relies on, if there's another stimuli that covers it up. So you can think about if you've ever been at a party and you're trying to listen to a friend talk, but the music is just too loud, right? That music is masking the ability for you to hear like voices. Things can be distracting. So, right, if I'm paying attention to a certain thing and then another stimuli comes in and it causes me to lose focus, or misleading. So if the color white means something ecologically, and now something that looks white and I can't discriminate it, but it's bad for me, right? That can lead to a maladaptive choice that can be problematic for a species, and it's sometimes referred to these as ecological and sensory traps. And so the example I wanted to pull out, thinking about this, is thinking about, right, how do we apply sensory ecology and sensory biology specifically to bat conservation? And so one issue where there is some cool work happening now is thinking about wind turbines. So millions of bats are killed every year by wind turbines. And it is not necessarily just that these bats are accidentally getting swept up in these places where wind farms are, but they also seem to potentially be attracted to the wind turbines themselves, or to the wind farms themselves. And so understanding the sensory cues that drives that attraction, whether it's direct attraction of I see a tall thing and I'm attracted to it, or something about a turbine or wind farm has attractive qualities, right, is going to be important for understanding to mitigate the impacts of this issue. And so a recent paper that was published just last year, right, using behavior, so using another, right, our alternative forced choice combined with kind of an escape response. So this is a natural response, didn't require any training, was looking at the role of visual cues at these turbines. So, right, are kind of asking like, maybe bats are using some kind of visual cue and something about the reflectivity of these turbines even at night, just under right moonlit conditions. Something about that is attractive to a bat. So the researchers set up this Y assay. So this is an example of another video of what this looks like, where a bat was released. One side contained one stimuli, so in this case, right, a bright piece of a turbine blade, and then one where it was painted black under natural lighting conditions. And so the bat is released, and you can see this bat has made the decision to exit via the side that had the brighter turbine in this case. And so what they found was that these bats, both for hoary bats and silver-haired bats, they selected the exit that had that white surface turbine at least twice as often as the less reflective exit. And they actually even still preferred that white object, even when there was nothing on the other side. So no potential obstruction on the other side. They were still attracted to that white, which suggests that at least in this case, they may be prioritizing vision over echolocation, which we know is a very important sense for bats moving in the environment. And so this kind of suggests maybe, right, maybe these turbine blades are leading to some kind of misleading sensory trap. So bats are seeing this bright thing. And while we may not know exactly what it is that they are seeing or why, but something about that is misleading them to think this is attractive. And so by knowing this, right, we can start to think about how do we exploit that knowledge to reduce the impacts on these bats. And so then just to wrap up, right, I do want to say, right, this is just a small taste of some of the cool work that's being done in sensory ecology of bats. Bats are incredibly diverse, and so are their senses. I haven't even touched on things like thermoreception or magnetoreception or the use of ultraviolet light, polarized light, how bats might be using these senses for things like migration, right? There are so many ways that we can integrate thinking about the sensory world of bats into many different aspects of bat ecology. I would argue that, right, the behavior is an important part of understanding these sensory cues. And that is important that if you're thinking about these kinds of questions, right, we want to have behavioral assays that are tailored to the question, right? Are you asking about discrimination or preference or detection and the species you're working with? So I struggled to get an insect eating auditory specialist to pay attention to odors. I had much more success when I was working with a bat that we already knew used its sense of smell. And then that I think there is continued space for linking sensory ecology and what we know about sensory ecology in bats to understanding and addressing conservation issues within bats and protect these species that we love so well. So this is some of the people think from the work that I presented that was my own, and then I will take questions. Sorry, that went a little long.
All right, no.
And then I'll just pitch, right, the book if you want more random bat things. I know it feels weird to do it, but it's there and exists. And there's a lot of a lot more cool stuff. I had so much fun writing that book and learning about all the cool research that people are doing. And
Yeah,
a lot of it's already
and I can also attest like the images that are within the book as
yes,
well are just
yes, yes, yes.
absolutely
Simply that,
spectacular.
forget the words, get it for the gorgeous photos. I was very
Gorgeous,
lucky to
gorgeous bats.
get incredible photos from people. So very
Well,
grateful.
thank you so much. That was such an excellent talk. I think it was a great way to kick off 2026. So thank you so, so much. We are at the top of the hour, but I do want to I can keep this going so we can at least try and do a couple of questions if people have time. Dr. Brokaw, I know you also have a schedule to keep. So if you have time, we could still take a couple of questions.
Yeah, I think I could have time for a couple. I know I went a little bit longer than I anticipated.
All right, let's see here. I know we got some in the chat. Do any okay. So this is a question from Ireland. They only have insectivorous bats in Ireland. Any more similar studies been done on insectivorous bats that you know of, or is it mostly focused on the frugivores and nectivores?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I ended up not. I was going to talk about it, and I would not have had time. So I'm glad I cut those slides. But I was going to talk. There is some work, and it kind of goes back and forth. So I'm interested in olfactory cues. So people have talked for a long time about like whether or not bats use olfactory cues or other cues to find roosts. Especially when people are like, I put up a bat house and the bats never came. How do I attract them? I get that question all the time. And so people have done work and are continuing to do work on like, are there things that we can use to attract these insect eating bats? Do odors work? TBD, we still don't know. It probably depends on the species and the specifics. But yeah, there's definitely a push to start to think about. I just started my position at Cedar Crest last fall, but I am hoping to kind of dig into some of that questions with the insect eating bats that I have here in Pennsylvania, and start to see if we can see odor responses. But yeah, I mean, sensory, right? It's everything. It's not just I'm odor biased, but it's all sorts of things.
We also had a kind of a silly comment. I think what was it? Someone said, "Oh, I will now forever refer to my dogs as barking sensory pollution." I like
Mine
that.
too.
Let's see. Does anyone have a question from like that wants to speak up? If so, raise your hand. That way I can just find you easily. Otherwise, we did have kind of some general questions in the chat as well. So we have, can we get a copy of this recording? Yes, it will be posted up on the YouTube later on today. So be ready for that. Where can people find the weird and wonderful world of bats? Where can people find it?
Yeah, so it should be available anywhere books are sold. I'll admit I'm not 100% sure on the more international distributions, but generally like Bookshop, Barnes and Noble, um, Amazon, all those places you can find it. And I think people have had been able to find it from various, not just the US. So now that, especially now that's been out a little bit longer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we also have this general question as well, which is where are the best places to learn about our specific local bat population and how to protect them? That very much, I would, and Dr. Brokaw might be able to say something similar along these lines. It very much depends on where you are.
Hmm.
And if you're in North America, you can always look up bats of this state, bats of this province to find out what your local distribution is going to be. If you're abroad, there, I'm in North America, I'm in Canada, so I'm not actually real sure, but GBatNet has some resources on their website, where if you go into our resources tab and look up the library, you can actually find lots of resources for bat facts around the globe. So you can look for your country or region through our library drop-down list to see if you can find your region and get some info about the bats of your area. So maybe Dr. Brokaw has some similar recommendations.
Yeah, I think looking into your, if you have like a local environmental commission, whether it's a state one or a county one, a lot of times those folks will be plugged into various, um, issues across all environmental, maybe not just bats, but if there's bats related, initiatives in your area, those would probably be people who are running them. And then also kind of sometimes like conservation nonprofits. Like I know there's like the African bat conservation networks.
Hmm.
There's a lot of European conservation networks. So those can also be good places to kind of start to see who's doing what in different places. And then um, always don't hesitate to reach out to people. You'll find that even though scientists, we tend to be kind of introverts, we also love to talk about the stuff we're working on and the animals we love, and it can be hard to get us to shut up. So don't be afraid to just reach out and ask people too. People
I
will love
I
to connect you with
could
things.
not agree with that more. If I feel like especially with bat folks, if you want to talk bats with a bat person, like a bat researcher or enthusiast, and I know I saw PA Bat Conservation's also in here, so I'm sure they could also go on and on and on about bats, the research that we're doing and things that get us excited about bats. And trying to bring it back to also the resources that you can find on the GBatNet website as well. GBatNet stands for the Global Union of Bat Diversity Networks. And so we have partners all over the world. Some of these organizations that Dr. Brokaw mentioned. So if you want to look for your country's regional bat conservation organization, you can find those resources either by looking them up directly or from the GBatNet website. So partners in Australia, New Zealand, the UK, Africa, all over the place, including many, many in Latin America as well. But yeah, other than that, I don't want to keep us too long after the top of the hour. So thank you again so much, Dr. Brokaw, for being our first talk of 2026. It was absolutely brilliant. But with that, we can go ahead and wrap it up for today. And hopefully I'll see a lot of you next time for our webinar on bats and forest management. So thank you all so much today.
Yeah, yes, thank you, everybody.